presentation, sort of a personal history, which is in addition to the longer written one. So if one of my ancestors ever wants to see what I look like, they can watch this video. I was born March 3rd, 1941 in Watsonville, California. I was the second child of James and Howard Fisk and Rose Fisk. Her maiden name was Fag. Our family lived there in Watsonville about 2 years following my birth, and I have no memory of that first 2 years. I understand that my father moved there in about 1937 or 39 for a new assignment with as assistant manager at the Watsonville J.C. Penney store. Our family, I understand, lived in a very small house based on what my mother told me. She said my crib was in the kitchen since the home had only limited bedroom space. In 43, about the time I was 2 years old, our family moved to Pacific Grove, California. We lived in Pacific Grove from 1943 to late 1946. As I recall, in Pacific Grove, our family lived in what I remember as a very big old house. We weren't very wealthy. The house was along a main road that ran from Pacific Grove to Monterey, and our home was not far from the famous Cannery Row that John Steinbeck immortalized in his novels. Those canneries were all closed when we lived there, but they were still standing, pretty much relics of the past. I believe we were only a couple of miles from Monterey. My most vivid memories of living in Pacific Grove were playing with my sister Beverly and her best friend Susan, and with my best friend Larry Burton. We played outdoors a lot. I remember such momentous occasions like jumping off the garage roof and walking on the tops of the hedges that surrounded our property. One of the more interesting events I remember from Pacific Grove was in 1945. My dad got us out of bed to go out and see a famous meteor shower that occurred that year. I was only 4, but I remember it vividly. It was raining meteors all over the sky, and the entire sky was full of streaking meteors. Hundreds of meteors going all at once. I've never seen any astronomical event close to this one. While in Pacific Grove, I attended kindergarten and first grade, and in 1946 our family moved to Bakersfield, into a small house my dad rented. He had gotten a promotion to assistant manager in the Bakersfield Penny store. The house we lived in was on the edge of town, and because Bakersfield was a very hot area, the house had an old evap cooler in a side window of the house. We didn't have air conditioning in the house. I remember my dad doing lots of repairing to that old crusted up evap cooler unit. We were in that house, I remember, in December at Christmas 1946, and that was the year I remember getting a Mark's train, model train, set for Christmas. And that was the year Bev and I got out of bed on Christmas Eve and snuck down the hallway and peeked through the crack in the door to see Mom and Dad sitting at the train and all of our other presents. So this was a year we confirmed some of the previous rumors we heard. older friends and neighbors. Santa wasn't bringing. We only lived there in Bakersfield about 6 or 7 months. Then we moved to Livermore, California in about March 1947. My dad had received a promotion to be store manager of the penny store in Livermore. In Livermore, we lived at 527 South Q Street. And at that time, Livermore was only about 4,000 people. We were kind of living on the edge of town at that time. We lived there growing up, and for the next for many more years, and I graduated from Livermore Joint Union High School in 1959. Growing up in Livermore was a personification of living in a small town in the 50s. I arrived there when I was in first grade. We went to what was then known as Fifth Street School, which was a big old 2-story imposing building with large plain classrooms. It even had cloakrooms. In those early days, 1947 and the early 50s, polio was a real threat and constantly in the news. Iron lungs were a commonly used therapy for people who caught the disease, so that was a pretty ominous image for us kids. And the other major social threat there in that era was the atomic war. We had frequent drills in school where you drop to the floor next to your desk and cover your head to deal with a nuclear attack. Remember, this was the height of the Cold War. Russian communists were regarded as very bad people. Our home on South Q Street was very typical and of average size. We had about 1,300 square feet, a 3-bedroom, single-bath house, living room, dining room, kitchen, laundry room, bedrooms, hall, bathroom. Had a detached single-car garage. Those were much more common those days. Our yard was about an average size. We had a big lawn in front and back of our house. In later years, in about 1956, we had a family room and 3/4 bath was added to the house, making it about 1,600 square feet. The house was within a block of the edge of town when we moved there, sort of in the southwest corner of the town of Livermore. So as children, we could get to the wide open spaces outside of the town very easily. Not far from our home was a perennial creek called Mocho Creek, which was a favorite area to play in the water and catch frogs and that sort of thing. As we grew older, us kids pretty much lived on our bikes, so we could easily cover the entire town and the surrounding area for about 5 miles out. Growing up, we spent lots of time swimming in the public pool in the summer, playing in the countryside, riding our bikes to favorite places. Other favorite pastimes growing up, including kids being obsessed with some current form of entertainment. For example, playing chess for days and hours on end, playing poker with a nickel limit, softball in the vacant lot next to the firehouse just up the street, playing roulette with a little plastic roulette set that we bet mostly pennies on. We didn't watch television. We didn't have one until later, and only a very few families had them until about the mid-50s. In 6th grade, I went to the junior high school at Junction Avenue School. One of the things I was involved in was, in 7th grade, was a club called Teen Timers. This was a club, I believe it was sponsored by the city recreation department, for 7th and 8th graders. And it existed primarily to have dances each week and for the kids of this age group to have something to do. As it turned out, my older sister, as an 8th grader, got elected co-president of the club with her boyfriend at the time. She was a very popular girl in our age group. And me and my girlfriend at the time were elected to be the 7th grade co-presidents. So dances were a rather popular form of entertainment for kids of our age. They had them every week. I didn't date much in high school. I was a little shy. I socialized a lot. It was normal to go to dances, stag, and so we did that a lot. Those were good years, of course. We all attended all the high school football games, most of the basketball games, went to all the dances, took part in most of the activities in high school. When I graduated from high school, the town in Livermore was about 14,000 people. Livermore Joint Union High School was the only high school in Livermore, and it had gotten to about 800 students when I graduated in 1959. My graduating class had about 135 students in it. We all knew each other well, and most of us grew up together in that town. I wasn't particularly athletic in school. I went out for track, mostly the high jump, the 100, 220, and 440 races in my sophomore year. I was pretty fast and a skinny little kid. I also broke my arm high jumping when I was a sophomore in high school. During the 1955 to 1959 time period when I was in high school, I believe some of the most best popular music that's ever been written came into being. It was just great dancing, melodious music, and the beginnings of rock and roll. The era of Elvis Presley and the Platters and all the doo-wop music. The Beatles didn't come along until about 1963. Also good music, but different than from the 50s. As for religion, I would say our family in Livermore when I was growing up wasn't particularly religious. We attended the Presbyterian church sometimes when I was younger, but I pretty much lived a non-religious life by the time I was high school age. I pretty much stayed non-religious all my life. I was active in Boy Scouts and then Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and the highest rank I received was Star, which was 5 merit badges at that time. One of my memories of Boy Scouts included having to memorize the Morse code. It was a requirement in those days to reach first class rank. I had a mental block and had an unusually hard time passing that one requirement. But overall, I have very happy memories of the scouting experience, especially summer camp at Diamond Old Boy Scout Camp, which was up in the Sierras, far to the east of Livermore. I believe it was up near Yosemite National Park. When I was in high school, I was a member of DMLA, a youth organization affiliated with the Masonic Lodge. My dad was a Mason, which probably had something to do with my getting involved. I went to the various offices in the organization, becoming the master counselor of the chapter, that's the chapter leader basically, in my junior year in high school. As it turned out, I attained this office rather young in life. I think I was the youngest master counselor ever in this particular chapter. Most master counselors were of college age. And one of the more interesting vacation experiences in my youth at about age 14 was a 5-day horseback trip into the backcountry of Yosemite National Park. We departed from the Tuolumne Meadows area and rode horseback for about 14 hours one day, I think about 20 miles. guide or wrangler that we'd hired to take us to this fishing spot got lost. But it was a great trip, and boy were we sore from riding. We didn't catch too many fish, but we had a great time. In high school, I had pretty good, but pretty average grades, about a B- or C+ average. I always excelled in drafting class. I did pretty good in math, algebra, trigonometry, etc. And the science classes, chemistry, biology. But I wasn't the best student in my peer group by any means. And I also did good in wood shop. I think the most valuable course I took in high school was typing. I was in a college prep program, so mostly I took the more advanced curriculum available in high school, the math and the science courses. I played the sousaphone in the high school band when I was a freshman, but gave up band after that year. I wasn't that good at it. I scored in the 97th percentile as a sophomore and the 94th percentile as a senior in high school on standard Iowa tests. I was told by the high school principal that I had an IQ of about 130, and I was also told I wasn't working up to my potential. The late 50s was the era of cruising. In a small town America, in every town, kids just cruised back and forth, up and down Main Street in the evening. Every car filled with kids. One evening, my friend who was driving kept track of his miles, and when I was with him in his 1957 Chevy Impala. In that one long evening, he had cruised 100 miles just back and forth around and around this small town, visiting the favorite hangouts. We'd stop at the wild to various places, such as the Foster Freeze, the A&W Drive-In, and later the Donut Shop. We spent lots of summer evenings just hanging out like this and talking. Mostly we talked about the girls we'd like to lust upon, and who was dating who, and who liked who, etc. Our own primitive mating rituals. Nobody said we were sophisticated or cool, just a bunch of zit-faced kids socializing in the only way we knew how. My first job, about 1958, was when I was in junior in high school. I was working part-time after school in a Western auto store, which happened to be the next door. The store happened to be next door to my parents' clothing store on the main street of downtown Livermore. Primarily, I was a clerk and a bicycle repairman. The pay was $1 an hour. In 1959 and 1960, I worked at the Alameda County Fair in Pleasanton, California, for part of the summer. I was a parking lot attendant and worked on a general work crew, repairing fences, etc. Got paid $1.50 an hour. And later I worked for a short time for a construction contractor, Rory Jensen Construction Company, cleaning off lots for future houses. My best friend, Roger Jensen, was the contractor's son, so that's why we got the job. This was the hardest job I ever had. We were cleaning a large acreage of grapevine stumps that had been all pulled out. Our job was to walk along next to a big dump truck and pick up the stumps and throw them onto the dump truck, and we did this for thousands of stumps, acres of land, on a hot summer day. After about 3 days, we were totally wiped out. Luckily, this job only lasted a few days. I also worked at a bowling alley as a desk person and relief janitor, paid $1.50 an hour. The 3 nights a week I worked as a janitor, we worked midnight to 8 a.m. straight through, no break, non-stop all night. In the summer of 1963, I worked for a structural engineer in Livermore for the summer, primarily as a draftsman. Got $1.50 an hour for that job. I always was one of the better draftsmen around, although my lettering wasn't as good as some of my fellow students, but I always generally got A's in drafting classes. I attended Stockton Junior College for 2 years after high school in kind of a general engineering curriculum. One of the apartments I lived in was really old and run down. It was an old maid's quarters studio apartment there in Stockton. It was in a building that was about 60 years old, an old house. That apartment cost $45 a month. My half was $22.50 a month. And while in college, I worked at a Sherwin-Williams paint store, primarily cleaning up, delivering paint, waiting on customers, etc., to kind of assist in my college expenses. The hourly wage there was $1.50 an hour. I got my first car in 1959. It was a used 1953 Chevy. I think it cost us $550. And later I wound up getting a American Motors Metropolitan, and then later 1965 Chevrolet Super Sport that would cost $3,600 new. That was a cool car. In kind of reflecting on my life, one of the incidents that kind of stuck with me was kind of a key moment that happened. I happened to be sitting in the office of my guidance counselor in the spring of 1961, working out where I was going to go on to college from there to a four-year university. And I was thinking at the time of going to Cal Berkeley. But as it turned out, I'd missed the cutoff date for the SAT test, and they required the SAT at Berkeley. So the counselor reached up on her shelf and pulled a college catalog from a little university there in California called Cal Poly, California State Polytechnic University. And that was what led me there. They didn't require the SAT test at that college, so I wound up going there that fall, and it sort of affected the direction my life went as a result. I went there and took the architectural engineering curriculum, and they had a option in the senior year called structural option, which is more structural engineering, and that's the direction I went, and wound up graduating in June 1964 with a Bachelor of Science degree from Cal Poly. Cal Poly was fairly unique in the state college system. The curriculum in the architectural engineering department was set up to weed out the slackers. I would later learn that it was said that only 20% made it through would make it through the Cal Poly architectural engineering curriculum. It involved lots of hours of work, and many times working on design projects all night. It was kind of a very cruel and arbitrary performance standard, but they wanted to have good students graduating from this department, and they didn't hesitate to fail anybody. My first year there saw many of my fellow students disappear, including one of them committed suicide. There were 135 kids in the class when I arrived, and slipped into what was basically the sophomore year of college, and there were about 80 left 2 years later when we were seniors. College was a great experience, especially the last year or so, when we really got into our major courses in structural engineering. and the more advanced material. One of the odd things that happened in my senior year at Cal Poly occurred in my advanced structural engineering class. The class was taught by an old German guy, Hans Mager. He was an excellent teacher. Well, it turned out the first test in that class had an extra credit problem at the end, and as it worked out, after I took that test, it turned out that I got the highest grade in class on that test. So that was a surprise because I didn't regard myself as all that smart compared to a lot of these other classmates I had. But anyway, the outcome was that Mr. Mager, from then on, figured I was one of his best students. And in many instances, gave me the benefit of the doubt on tests, etc. I now recommend that any student going to college make it a point to ace that first test in any class. It will likely pay dividends later. One of the funny things about college is once you bubble up to near the top of the class, people tend to expect you belong there. College got easier in some ways. I actually only got one D in my college career, and that was in chemistry back at Stockton College. At Cal Poly, I graduated with the fourth highest grade point average of the 80 architectural engineering and architectural engineering structural option students in our department. I had a 2.94 GPA, which was a B average. Of course, those were the days before grade escalation. The average student overall grade point was about 2.3, 2.4. I started work with the Army Corps of Engineers on June 17, 1964, right after graduation. I'd interviewed with them at college, and they offered the best combination of job training and pay. In addition, I managed to avoid military service because of that employer, because he was a Department of Defense employer. At that particular time, the Vietnam War was just becoming active, and I really didn't believe in that particular war. My view was it was a political situation, not a war, or not a real war we should be involved in, and it was more primarily a civil war. So I thought the logic of our involvement was seriously flawed, and I think history's tended to confirm that perspective. At my first full-time job at the Army Corps of Engineers, starting pay in 1964 was about $6,200 a year. In that particular situation, they sent you off away from the district for a time period as kind of an intern program, and I went to Vandenberg Air Force Base. So I received $16 a day tax-free per diem in addition to my salary. So, in essence, I think it made me, for the first few months anyway, it made me the highest paid graduate of my Cal Poly graduating class. But the TDY only lasted 6 months. My pay, of course, did rise steadily each year, and by 1980, I was being paid $35,033 a year, and it kept going up from there, which is some of the reasons that that I stayed with the Corps, because when I originally went in, I really wasn't thinking of staying with them for a long career. I figured it would be more a personal development training type job. As it turned out, what I was involved in is the Corps administers contracts and does the inspection and so forth on the construction of building and structures on military installations, and that's what I was involved in initially. I spent my entire career with the Corps of Engineers in the construction division, primarily because I preferred not to be stuck behind a desk. The job itself has been very similar over the years. It runs the spectrum of reviewing the work for quality, taking part in tests and checkouts of installed systems, and solving problems that come up during the building process, and coordinating various activities with the base personnel. We did such things as develop the pay requests from the contractor for processing. We wrote and negotiated change orders. We resolved disputes with the contractor. And of course, in my job, there was a certain amount of training Corps of Engineers staff people. Most of the projects were things like chapels and dormitories and hospitals and office buildings, and we did flight simulator buildings and missile launch towers at Vandenberg, a lot of industrial type buildings on the military installation, warehouses, runway improvements, all that sort of thing. We did some emergency operations type activities, which is kind of like emergency flood control works when there was a flooding situation somewhere, a national disaster or natural disaster. Kind of a quick overview of my career with the Corps, and the different places I worked included from June '64 when I started to June '66. I worked at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Lived at Lompoc, California the first year, and second year I lived in Santa Maria, both towns near Vandenberg Air Force Base. The jobs I was involved in primarily were what they called the Launch Facilities Project Office, which was, we did modifications to Titan II underground silos, and we modified a lot of missile towers there, launch towers there at Vandenberg Air Force Base. In July '66 to January '67, I was sent to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, temporarily to assist in a big buildup of construction down there. It's what they call the Southeast Asia Project. It involved a lot of modifications to buildings there and some additional buildings at Fort Huachuca for the troop buildups that were training there at Fort Huachuca. We were kind of bored with the town of Sierra Vista. It was kind of a small town at that time, and so we actually worked a lot of long hours while in Sierra Vista because there wasn't much else happening down there. In January '67, I was transferred to March Air Force Base in California. I lived in Riverside, California at the time. I worked there till March 1970, about 3 years. Again, doing building type construction at March Air Force Base. When I was first sent to March, there were some problems of coverage of work at the installations in that area, so they wound up appointing me to a supervisory position covering the work at March Air Force Base, a resident engineer position, and that was my first management job with the Corps of Engineers. At the time I was promoted, I was one of the youngest resident engineers the Corps ever had in our district. I only had about 3 to 5 people working for me there. And the buildings we built were included a base chapel at March Air Force Base, which is probably the best looking building I was ever involved in. And we did a lot of industrial and office type buildings and dormitories there while I was assigned there. In March 1970 to October 1970, I applied for and got to go to a job at Hahn Air Force Base, Germany. Germany had a big build-up, and our needs were diminishing in Southern California. So they sent a bunch of us who wanted to go TDY to Germany for 6 months, 6 or 7 months. And so me and Sylvia went to Germany, really enjoyed Germany. We lived in the little town of Kirchberg, Germany, on the economy, and traveled a lot while we were in Germany. It was a real experience. Primarily at Hahn Air Force Base there in Germany, they were building these concrete shelters for fighter jets. It was one of the NATO bases in Germany. And that lasted until about November 1970, and that's when the Corps transferred me back and sent me to Williams Air Force Base, Arizona. We lived at the time at Mesa, Arizona. And they sent me to Williams to start working on a new hospital there, the base hospital at Williams Air Force Base, which we built again in 1970, 1971, and it's still in use now as a VA clinic since they closed Williams Air Force Base 30 years later. Williams was a small resident office. I had a staff of about 3 to 5 people there at Williams also. We also built a lot of other buildings there, dormitories, flight simulator buildings, built a huge warehouse, lots of office buildings. From December 73 to May 77, I had been transferred to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and we lived in Sierra Vista. They sent me to Fort Huachuca for a major program starting up at Fort Huachuca, what they called the Intelligence School Complex. It was a whole college campus, basically. But about the time I arrived, they Congress delayed the program, and they kept delaying it for about 3 more years. And so we really didn't get started the whole time I was there at Fort Huachuca. But we did a lot of other work, did some very interesting and innovative design-build housing projects, did lots of dormitories and BOQs, and a lot of building renovations and upgrades while we were there. In May 1977, I had the opportunity to move from Sierra Vista, which made me very happy because I really didn't like Sierra Vista very much. It was kind of a small town with not much to do. They didn't even have a movie theater in the town of Sierra Vista when we lived there. But anyway, in 1977, they moved me up to the Phoenix resident office, and we bought a house in Phoenix in 1977, and have lived there from then until the present at a home here on 44th Street. I started out in Phoenix because they needed me to work on what we call an Environmental Protection Agency program for helping to oversee a large EPA program on wastewater management projects being built by city and county governments and sanitary districts all over Arizona and Nevada. Basically, the Corps was hired by the EPA to kind of oversee the construction phases of these projects to see that the federal interest was watched out for. And I worked on that program for a year or so, and then I became chief of construction support branch when the office was turned into an area office, and it was in about 1981 that I eventually got promoted to a GS-13. And at that point, I supervised a staff of technical people from about 7 to 14 people, depending on what we had under our management responsibility. We had a really innovative and excellent group of people working for me, engineers and technicians, in that construction support branch in Phoenix. And I really think that we were instrumental in upgrading the overall quality and professionalism of the Corps of Engineers in their work in Arizona. In fact, I believe we probably had the best organization of its type in the whole country. We had some of the most technically competent experts working for me, and they taught at the national level for the Corps of Engineers in the Corps' training programs. And they were often tapped by, say, headquarters in Washington to take part in committees and study groups on ways to improve the Corps. That pretty much summarizes my work history. I retired in 1999 from the Corps, July 31st, and have been enjoying retirement ever since. Going back to a little earlier, in 1964, like I say, we lived in Lompoc, enjoyed it there. Me and another fellow, Jack Farless, roomed together for that first year that we were out of college. Met a couple of girls in Lompoc who had come there and lived in our apartment house. Jack Farless wound up marrying the girl that he was dating. The girl I was dating moved back to Colorado, where she came from. From 1967 in Riverside was when I, of course, was still single and dated a girl named Barbara for about a little over a year. She's a very beautiful girl. She could have been a model, but she was a little flaky in some respects, and so we quickly parted ways when I met Sylvia. I met Sylvia in August 1968 there in Riverside, and we actually wound up getting married about 5 months later. Met Sylvia on the balcony of our apartment house. She was moving in at the time, and I helped her and her roommates move some stuff into their apartment. I knew right at the moment I met Sylvia that this might be the girl that I could be marrying someday. I think we clicked very quickly. We got married February 1st, 1969. Had a small wedding in the Riverside LDS Church. And bought our first house in Riverside about September 1969. That was shortly before we went to Germany. When we went to Germany in 1970, we traveled around quite a bit, took a lot of long weekends off, and traveled to numerous places such as England, Luxembourg, Paris, Holland, Bavaria, most of southern Germany, and saw a lot of sights and really enjoyed our stay there. I eventually came back, like I said earlier, to Williams Air Force Base, and we wound up living in Mesa and working at Williams Air Force. Working at Williams Air Force Base for the next 3 years. Dan was born in 1973 when we lived there, and in 1974 I moved to Fort Huachuca. It was about that point that I passed the registered professional engineer examination to become PE in Arizona. I also later became a registered professional land surveyor in Arizona. Daughter Laura came along in January '75, born in Sierra Vista. I continued to work again at Fort Huachuca, and when we moved to Phoenix shortly thereafter, in July '77, Craig was born. As it turned out, the day Craig was born, I was traveling due to my job down to Fort Huachuca, which is about 180 miles from Phoenix, and got a phone call that Sylvia was starting to deliver, so I immediately headed home. But unfortunately, I wasn't there in time for the actual birth. I missed it by about 2 hours on the road between Sierra Vista and Phoenix. And our youngest daughter was daughter Holly was born in Phoenix in January 1979. Let's see. We bought our home in Phoenix when we moved there in May '77 for about $75,000. In the year 2002, its market value is probably $240,000 or so. As I said earlier, on July 31st, 1999, I retired from the Corps, which was a welcome change. I think I was a little tired of the government bureaucracy. Seemed to be increasing. Some of the best leaders in the organization, I think, had quit or moved on or retired. And I'm really enjoying retirement. Get to sleep late, visit our grandchildren, pretty much do what we want. We have a fifth wheel trailer we bought several years ago, and I really enjoy going camping with that RV because it's pretty comfortable camping. And we've been keeping active. We've taken college art classes, and we've done a lot of family history stuff. We work in the family history library one day a week. Of course, had a lot of other things that were a lot different than probably some of the younger people who are watching this tape are used to or take for granted. I just pick out a few typical examples of some of the things that were a little different when I was growing up, just in case some younger people someday watch this tape. These are just kind of a bunch of random examples that I thought of. For example, home refrigerators. A lot of people didn't even have them when I was a small child. They had ice boxes, and the iceman would deliver ice every few days, big 50-pound block. And he'd come around and do that on a regular basis. Of course, we didn't have things like Xerox machines when I was growing up. They didn't come along to the early 1960s. There were, of course, no home computers. The first desktops arrived about 1970. First office home computers, or office desktop computers we got didn't arrive until about 1984. We first bought a cheap IBM clone computer. It cost about $2,000 then, in about 1987. And of course, the interfaces were not graphical interfaces like they have now. They were just the words on the screen, words and numbers on the screen. There was, of course, no internet. That didn't come around until about 1990. There weren't any tape recorders until about 1950, and certainly no tape cassettes until a little later. There weren't any CDs, of course. We had records back then, and LP records, but CDs hadn't been invented yet until about 1980. Cars had no seat belts when I was growing up. Cars were typically didn't get seat belts until the early 1960s. And cars were larger in those days. They were all full-size cars mostly. They got about 15 miles a gallon, and they typically would seat 6 people. The small cars like the Volkswagen were just starting to become popular in about the 1960s. In the cars, we only had AM radios. We didn't have any FM. Of course, there were no tape players, and there were no CD units in cars in those days. There wasn't even air conditioning in cars until about the late 50s, early 1960s. And then everybody didn't have it. Only the best cars, like the Cadillacs and what have you, had air conditioning. There weren't any fast food restaurants when I was a kid. Fast food came along about the 1950 era, and the only place you could buy pizza was in an Italian restaurant. Of course, we didn't have the air pollution back in those days. You could still see the stars out at night, and you see a lot more of them than you can today around the city. Coca-Cola came in bottles when I was a kid. Milk came in bottles. Phones had dials, and they only came in black. There weren't, of course, any orbiting satellites back then. The first orbiting satellite was put into the air. That was Sputnik, put up by the Russians in 1957, and all it did was beep. And it was many years before we had such things as satellite TV. There wasn't any cable TV when I was growing up. There was only 4 or 5 TV channels available. There were no cell phones. I think, as I said earlier, we didn't even have a television set till about the mid-1950s. In college, we used slide rules. The pocket calculator was just invented about 1960, and scientific calculators, when they first came out, cost $400. Now you can buy one in the store for probably less than $10. There weren't any digital cameras, no video recorders. Penicillin didn't start becoming popularly used until the early 1940s. The polio vaccine didn't come along until the early 1950s. So a lot of things were different then. I think the general cultural characteristics were a lot more politically conservative than they are today. A lot of differences in that regard. So anyway, that's pretty much the extent of this tape. This tape, by the way, was made on 21 July 2002. And thank you for watching, and I hope this gives some of the younger people some insight into the era in which I lived and some of the things that I was involved in. Thanks for watching. First orbiting satellite
Came into this world on November 11th, 1945, born into the family of Ray Walker West and Alice Melinda Casper West. They named me Sylvia, with no middle name. I had 2 brothers who were older. Ralph was about 3 and a half at the time. Harold about 2 and a half. They were only 9 and a half months apart. And I was the youngest and only daughter born into the family. My mom was 38 by the time I was born. In addition to my brothers, I had a foster sister, Gloria Casper, who was actually my biological cousin. She was kind of my bed partner and closest thing I had to a sister. And grandmother Casper lived with us, and also Uncle Bill. Both played a big part in my life. The first event that is somewhat memorable to me, I probably don't really remember, but people told me about it so many times that I sort of think I remember it. It was in the winter of 1946, 1947. I was about a year and a half old. And at the time, Uncle Merle and his wife, Aunt Myra, and their children were staying with my family. And there was a lot of people when you'd have any sort of meal. Well, one meal, which was a lunchtime, it seemed that everyone got sick after eating. And in fact, we were very sick. There were a few people who weren't. Uncle Bill was not, and my dad was not, who happened to be a stake missionary at the time. And it got to be a very serious situation. Uncle Bill was holding me, and he said, turned to my dad, and he says, "Ray, this little girl is going to die if you don't do something." And Uncle Bill described me as being as limp as a dish rag, and my skin was transparent. And so Dad walked over to a neighbor's house. At that time period, we didn't have telephones in every house in the rural community. And he called the doctor and explained our situation, and after talking to him, the doctor told him that it sounded like we had food poisoning, and the best thing to do was to just get a whole bunch of water down us, and if that didn't work, there was nothing he could do. Well, Dad came back and started giving everybody lots of water, and it didn't help at all. We were just getting sicker and sicker. So finally, Dad started giving blessings to us. I was first, because apparently I was the sickest. And as the time progressed, everyone had been given a blessing, and by that time, I was up running around playing. And by the time the brothers and older brothers and sisters got home from school of these two families, they couldn't believe anyone had been sick, because we certainly didn't appear to be that way at the moment. The nature of the illness was a food poisoning, and we traced it back to probably ketchup. I'm not real sure how that worked, but I know I never ate ketchup again. Apparently I loved the stuff at the time, but that was the end of ketchup for me. At that time, we lived in a very old house, probably built in the 1880s. It had a big front porch and a big lawn out front. In fact, the lawn area was so big that it was used one year as the 24th of July celebration for our ward in Meridian, Idaho. And I especially liked that house. I enjoyed going out in the garden. We always had a huge garden, and we'd have strawberries and raspberries, but raspberries were kind of growing up on bushes, and I couldn't reach them very well. I was kind of built short to the ground, and so I really liked strawberries. That's where I could find them and eat them quickly. Another favorite food was peas, and there were always extra rows of peas growing just for me. And so I would eat the peas and make little boats out of them and sail them down the little irrigation canals that we made for this garden. At the time, it seemed like this house was huge. Given the fact I wasn't very big, it probably was not as huge as I think it is. One of the things that we enjoyed doing while we were there was going on little trips to the store, the grocery store. Every week we went to the grocery store on Saturday, and Dad really enjoyed this. He would take all of us and go to the store, buy us things like blackjack chewing gum, which is kind of a licorice flavored chewing gum that I haven't seen in years. But he really liked it, and I thought it was great too, probably because Dad liked it. and he would always buy some ice cream cone. And I can remember having the lapel of my coat kind of hard because it had all this dried up ice cream on it. When we went to town, this was a whole 3 miles, so it was not much of a ride, but as kids we thought this was a big deal. And when we would ride in the car, we would listen to the radio. And we weren't listening to music in the radio, we were listening to radio programs, which were like the Lone Ranger and the Shadow. And these were usually half-hour programs, and so sometimes we would wait in the car and finish the program after we got home because we wanted to see how it ended. As a child, I was very verbal, learned how to talk fluently as a very small child, and so everyone gave me a lot of attention and encouraged me to do the things that I enjoyed doing. I was always able to draw. We had plenty of paper and crayons for me, and I showed an early interest in mathematics and sciences. In fact, when I was 4 years old, my brothers took me to school to, I guess I was show and tell or something, and the teacher stood me up on one of the desks and had me count to 100 and recite the ABCs, and that was such a big deal. It really impressed me. Another thing that impressed me about this school, which was a 2-room schoolhouse, was that they had these really neat field trips. One time, my mother got to go on one, probably as some sort of chaperone, or maybe she was driving a bunch of children, and I went with her. We went to a bakery. It was Eddie's Bakery in Boise, and that was a real thrill to watch the bread being baked, and then they had these donuts that were going down a conveyor belt, and the tour guide grabbed some of the donuts for us, and we were able to each have a donut. That was a wonderful trip. By the time both of my brothers were in school, my father still needed to have someone to help on the farm with little tasks. One of these tasks was in raking the hay. We had what was called a dump rake, and it had a seat on the rake, and someone would sit on that, and when it was the right time, they'd push a little lever with their foot, and all the hay that accumulated in this rake would dump. And then you would go a little bit farther and do it again, and after a while you'd line up all these rows of hay, and then you were able to bale them. Well, this one year, when I was 4 years old, both of my brothers were in school, and it was time to finish the hay. It was in the fall, and my father needed help, and I was so little I really couldn't operate this dump rake on my own. And so he built he tied a block of wood on the foot lever so that it would be higher and I could reach it. I still had to stand up and put all of my weight on it to make this dump happen the way it was supposed to. Another time, about that time period, he needed to have me drive the tractor. Well, of course, I couldn't even see to drive a tractor, nor did I know how to stop it, turn it, anything. And so I would stand up by the steering wheel so I could see through it and pick out a fence post at the far end of the field and steer toward it and just hope that everything turned out okay. My fear was that I could not see my father because he was behind me, and at the end of the field the fence was coming closer and closer to me, and I was afraid we would run into it. But sure enough, every time we got close to the fence, my dad magically showed up and turned the tractor around for me and sent me toward another fence post at the other end of the field. This really made me feel like I was important, that I was contributing to the family. As a family, we didn't go on a lot of vacations, but I do remember a few that seemed to have happened within about a year. When I was in the age of about 5, we went to Yellowstone, and of course no one had told me that Yellowstone has bears, and so I was very comfortable being there. But we slept out. We didn't have sleeping bags. I don't recall that sleeping bags were very common at the time. At least our family didn't have any. This would have been about 1950. We had a big canvas tarp, and Mom put blankets and pillows on top of this tarp, and we had a great big family bed, and that's how we slept out. For food, my dad went fishing and managed to catch enough fish to make dinner. We didn't have any cooking equipment that you would think of that you might take camping other than an iron skillet. So Mom produced everything in the iron skillet. We had no camp stove. We had no lanterns. When it got dark, we went to bed, or else we stayed up with a little bit of light from the fire that Dad would have built. And on the way home from that, I believe, is when we stopped at the Craters of the Moon. Now, I was impressed with Yellowstone, with the geysers, but when I got to Craters of the Moon, this was really interesting rock. And it was so interesting that I insisted that I take one home with me. It's probably the beginning of my rock collection, and probably an important event that helped me grow into a geologist. About that same time period, we went on another trip to the Oregon coast, and in fact down a little bit into California, to the redwood forest and at the ocean. The ocean was a real disappointment to me. It was cold, gray, overcast. I was expecting something prettier, but then I turned my interest to collecting shells on the beach. And actually, at that time in U.S. history, you could find shells at the beach. And I found a nice big shell and kept it for years. When I was about 5, we moved from Meridian, Idaho, to Vail, Oregon, which is about maybe 50, 60 miles. And during that move, I had been 5 years old, but I turned 6 a couple months after we moved. Because of that, I missed starting school. In Idaho, I wasn't old enough. In Oregon, I was old enough, but we weren't there at the right time, so I didn't get to go. This was first grade that I was missing. They did not have preschool or kindergarten at that time, at least in Idaho and Oregon. And so I did not get to go to school that year. And I stayed home and didn't really have many people to play with. It was a new home for us, although a very old house. Here again, it was probably built in the 1880s or maybe 1900. This farm had 2 large houses. Ours was smaller. The other one, which was built in the 1880s, had been built as a mansion and was still preserved somewhat nicely. The one we lived in was a real mess. And during that first winter, I remember my dad created a bathroom because all we had was an outhouse. And he put linoleum on the floor. The floors up to that point had been bare wood. He put in some cabinets in the kitchen and tried to make it somewhat livable. And he and my mother painted the interior of the house. Let me tell you about this outhouse we had. It was a 2-holer, which is great. You gotta have company, I guess, if you're going to the outhouse. And it had a Sears catalog for emergencies or for reading. And Mom used to regularly take lime out and throw the white powder down the toilet, and it kind of kept some of the smell away. And if you did run out of toilet paper, there was that index to the Sears catalog, which could be used if that's all you had. The next year, I was able to start first grade. We had to walk maybe a quarter of a mile to catch the bus, and I went with my brothers, and so it was not too scary. I remember a couple times in the wintertime when it would snow, the snow would be deeper than my snow boots, and so my snow boots would kind of get filled up with snow. On the other hand, being a first grader, my snow boots were probably not over about 6 or 8 inches high, so it really wasn't a humongous amount of snow we had there. It just appeared to be to me because I was so short. When I first moved there, my mom saw that I really needed something to do because I was a little bit bored living at this new place and not having any friends. And so she introduced me to her sewing machine. Now, this was not a toy. This was a real Singer sewing machine. It was built in 1891. It was very old at the time, but very sturdy, and there really wasn't much I could do to destroy it. And so she taught me the very basics of how to work this sewing machine. I spent many hours, sometimes I would work till 10 o'clock at night, making something out of crepe paper. Crepe paper cost about 10 cents a roll. It was pretty cheap. My mom could afford to supply me with all the crepe paper I needed. And I would construct little costumes and anything else I could think of. One year, in second grade, I made little witches' costumes for myself and my friend who lived next door. And as I recall, we didn't actually go trick-or-treating, but we had a heck of a good time making these costumes. My mom let me use the sewing machine, but she really didn't spend a lot of time instructing me on how to use it. It was kind of a trial and error. I did sew my finger one time, and I was very frustrated because I was trying to do something and I had this finger stuck in the sewing machine. And no one was around. I don't know where people were, but they weren't right there. And so I had to back the needle out of my finger, and I put it under the faucet and ran water on it, and then went back to sewing. So I discovered, though, that after you've had an experience like that, you don't ever stick your finger where the needle is coming down. I did have an aunt. Her name was Aunt Ida, and about twice a year she would come visit us on her way to the Idaho Falls Temple. And she sewed quite well. And so she would help me do little things and teach me whatever she could that I was working on at the time. And then eventually I was able to read a little bit, and I could use patterns, which really helped. And but I learned to just kind of look at the pictures of the pattern rather than read it. And I'm afraid that that's still pretty much what I do. But it was very effective because they had really good illustrations. And so during that time period, I learned how to handle fabrics with a sewing machine. I learned how to repair the sewing machine, fix the tension. I just really learned that Singer sewing machine. By the time I took sewing classes in home ec when I was a freshman in high school, I had 9 years of experience in sewing. And so even though I learned a lot, I was very good at it at that point because I'd had so much experience. And it was a very fun thing for me to do. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. While we lived in Vail, my brothers and I would have friends over occasionally, but basically we lived on a farm, and we were far enough away from the town that you didn't have a lot of people come over, and so we kind of played with each other. I remember one time the little black hen had decided to hatch out a few little chicks, and she was the only one that did that year. All the other hens gave up their eggs for people to use. And anyway, this hen hatched out her chicks, and when she was finished and she walks off with her cute little black chicks, there was 2 or 3 extra eggs that had not hatched. And so my brothers thought, hey, this is going to be fun. Let's break open these rotten eggs. And sure enough, these were rotten eggs that smelled really bad. Except by the time we got to about the 3rd egg, we found a chicken inside of it that had not yet fully developed. it still had the yolk, and it wasn't ready to hatch, but we had cracked its shell. And so we took the little chicken and put it inside of its shell, put it in a cardboard box and put it behind the wood-burning stove in the living room where it would be warm. And in 2 or 3 days, the yolk was absorbed into the chicken, and the chicken was ready to come out. And so we had this small chicken that was now a ½ inch or so shorter than the other little black chickens, and we took this chicken and gave it to its family. The only thing was, the hen did not recognize this as her chick, even though it was the only... Try this again. The hen did not recognize this chick as belonging to her, and had wanted nothing to do with it. But with a little persistence, we managed to put this little chick in the family and let it follow behind the others. And eventually, I guess they figured they couldn't get rid of it, so they might as well accept it as their little chick. And it was always a little bit smaller than the others, but it grew up to be a fine, healthy chicken. Another animal that really stood out in my mind during that time we lived in Vale was a turkey we had. We had 1 tom and 6 hens, and of course we named the tom turkey Tom. So Tom became my friend. In the evening, the hens and Tom would go sit on a low fence, and that would be their roost. But also in the evening, frequently my dad and my brothers and I would play baseball in the yard, and Dad would turn the yard lights on so you could see. And this Tom would get off the roost and come over and stand by me in the outfield and help me catch the balls. In fact, he was big enough that a few did hit him. So he became quite a good friend and buddy. Well, one day I was weeding in the flower garden, and by then we had several large offspring of this turkey that we called Tom. And Tom wasn't real close by, but some of these other younger